The sun had barely risen over the alien city, casting long shadows across the towering structures made of silver and glass. The city was quiet, save for the hum of advanced technology in the air. The human soldier, Mark, stood near the entrance of the royal palace, keeping a sharp eye on the bustling scene before him. He had been assigned to guard the princess, but little did he know that this mission would be unlike any other. Mark had always been a soldier, someone who followed orders without question, but there was something different about this assignment. The princess, a member of one of the most powerful families in the galaxy, was said to be untouchable, an embodiment of grace and authority. But as Mark was led through the marble halls by an attendant, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the princess than just her royal status. She was beautiful, of course. Everyone knew that. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught his attention. It was the air of loneliness that seemed to follow her, a kind of isolation that no amount of wealth or power could cure. She was distant, as if her royal duties had forced her to build walls around her heart. As he followed the attendant through the grand hallways, Mark couldn't help but wonder what kind of person the princess really was, beyond the rumors and stories. When they finally arrived at the princess's private chambers, Mark was introduced to her. She sat at a grand desk, surrounded by reports from her empire, her expression focused and unreadable. Her long, dark hair fell neatly around her face, and her eyes, though sharp and intelligent, seemed cold, guarded. "Your Highness, this is the human soldier assigned to protect you during your stay," the attendant said, bowing slightly before leaving the room. The princess barely acknowledged Mark's presence at first, continuing her work as if he wasn't there. It wasn't unusual for royalty to be aloof, but Mark couldn't help but feel a twinge of discomfort. She had not looked at him once. "Do you have a name, soldier?" she finally asked, her voice calm, almost indifferent. "Mark, Your Highness," he replied, standing at attention. The princess nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the documents in front of her. Mark couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. He had expected someone more engaged, but then again, how could he expect anything different? She was a royal, and he was just a soldier. For the next few hours, Mark remained in the corner of the room, observing the princess as she worked. The silence between them was thick, as if neither of them knew how to bridge the gap. Mark had heard stories of how distant royalty could be, but he hadn't expected this kind of coldness. The princess was not like the others he had met before. There was a certain sadness in her eyes that he couldn't quite place. Mark couldn't help but wonder what had led her to become this way. Was it the weight of her position, or was there something more? The longer he watched her, the more he wanted to know. But he knew better than to ask. After all, he was just her guard. No more, no less. As the day wore on, Mark's thoughts drifted. He had no idea that this seemingly ordinary mission was about to take a turn, one that would change everything he knew about the princess and about himself. As the days passed, Mark grew accustomed to his role as the princess's guard. He stood by her side during meetings, accompanied her during royal events, and kept his distance when she wished for solitude. But no matter how hard he tried to remain just a soldier, something about her fascinated him. The princess, whose name was Lyra, continued to be the epitome of cold royalty in public. In the presence of her people, she exuded authority, her every word carefully chosen, her every action deliberate. But when the crowds dispersed, Mark saw another side of her, one that surprised him. It happened one afternoon during a quiet break between formal events. The palace garden, usually filled with guests, stood empty, save for Mark and Lyra. She walked along the stone pathway, her heels tapping softly against the ground. Mark was at a respectful distance behind her, as he always was. But something seemed different today. Lyra had no entourage, no attendants following her. She seemed, for the first time, to be entirely alone. As she paused near a fountain, her hands clasped behind her back, Mark dared to speak. "Your Highness, do you ever feel tired of all this?" His voice was cautious, unsure if he should be intruding. Lyra turned, raising an eyebrow. For a moment, she said nothing, as if considering his question carefully. "Tired," she repeated softly, "of being surrounded by people who only want something from me, or of wearing a mask every day." Mark nodded, sensing that she was talking about more than just her royal duties. There was something deeper in her voice, something raw. "I suppose I do," she continued, her gaze softening as she looked up at the clear sky. "I was raised to rule, to be perfect, but no one ever taught me how to just be. To not be constantly watched, judged, or expected to fit into the role others created for me." Mark felt a pang of sympathy. He had always seen the princess as untouchable, a person whose life was filled with power and privilege. But now, seeing the weariness in her eyes, he realized that perhaps it wasn't so easy for her. "You must feel very lonely," Mark said quietly. He immediately regretted the words. He wasn't supposed to get too personal. He was her guard after all. Lyra didn't seem offended. Instead, she looked at him with something like surprise. "Lonely?" she asked. "No one has ever dared to say that to me." Mark, suddenly embarrassed by his boldness, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Sorry, I didn't mean to." "It's all right," Lyra interrupted with a small smile. "I suppose I am lonely. Being a princess means never truly being able to trust anyone. Everyone has an agenda, even the ones who smile at you the most." Mark was taken aback. He had always thought of royalty as a world full of allies and companions. But Lyra's words made him rethink everything. She didn't just have enemies. She had no one who genuinely understood her. "I never thought of it that way," Mark admitted, stepping a little closer. "I've always been just a soldier, following orders. But I started to see that there's more to you than your title." The princess turned to him, her eyes studying his face, as if weighing his sincerity. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but instead, she turned away and stared at the water in the fountain. The moment passed, and Mark felt the distance between them grow again. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like something more, something unspoken that was slowly beginning to shift. Mark didn't know where this unexpected bond was leading, but something inside him told him it was only the beginning. The princess wasn't the untouchable royal he had once believed her to be. She was just a person, like him, carrying burdens he couldn't fully understand. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to see him as more than just a soldier. The days that followed were a mix of routine and unexpected moments of quiet connection. Mark had grown used to guarding Princess Lyra, but something had changed between them. No longer was she the distant, untouchable royal he had first met. Instead, he saw her as a person, someone who, despite her power and title, carried a heavy burden. Mark couldn't help but notice the way she would sometimes drift into silence, her thoughts far away, even in the middle of a conversation. There were moments when her eyes would glaze over, and he would catch the faintest sigh escape her lips. It was as if she was trapped in a world of expectations, unable to break free. One evening, after another long day of formal events, Lyra invited Mark to join her for dinner in the palace's private dining room. It was a rare moment of peace, just the two of them. As they sat at the long table, the flickering candlelight cast soft shadows across her face, making her look even more distant than usual. "Is something troubling you, Your Highness?" Mark asked, his voice tentative. He had learned to be careful around her, to not overstep his boundaries, but he couldn't ignore the way she seemed so burdened. Lyra put down her fork, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like ages. She studied him quietly, almost as if she were weighing whether or not to speak. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "It's not easy being in my position, Mark," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I carry the weight of an entire empire on my shoulders, and no matter what I do, it's never enough. Every decision I make is scrutinized, and every move I make is watched." Mark frowned, unsure of how to respond. He had never thought about it that way. For most of his life, he had simply followed orders. He hadn't been the one to make life-altering decisions. He couldn't imagine the kind of pressure Lyra must face every day. "I spent my whole life being told what I must do, how I must act," she continued, her eyes staring down at the table. "And now I have to decide the future of a people I barely know. How am I supposed to be perfect? How can anyone live up to such expectations?" Her words hit Mark harder than he expected. He had seen the princess as powerful and unshakable, someone who seemed to have everything under control. But now, hearing the doubt in her voice, he realized how fragile she was behind that mask of royalty. "You don't have to be perfect," Mark said quietly. "No one is, and no one expects you to carry the weight of an empire alone." Lyra's eyes flickered up to meet his. For a moment, she seemed unsure, but then a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Thank you, Mark," she said softly. "It's just, I've never had anyone tell me that before. Everyone around me is always trying to shake me into something I'm not, something I can never be. But you see me as I am." Mark felt a warmth spread through him. He didn't know if he was ready to be the person who could take away her burdens, but he felt an overwhelming need to help her, to make her see that she wasn't alone. As the evening wore on, they talked more, their conversation shifting from the weight of her duties to lighter topics. Mark shared stories of his travels, and Lyra laughed, a sound Mark had never heard before. It was soft, genuine, and unlike the royal laughter he had heard in public. For the first time, she seemed like she was just a person, not a princess. And for the first time, Mark saw a glimpse of what life could be like if they were free from the roles they had been forced to play. It was a small moment, but it meant more to Mark than he could put into words. The walls between them were starting to crumble, and in that quiet room, they both took a step toward something neither of them had expected. The days that followed were a mix of routine and unexpected moments of quiet connection. Mark had grown used to guarding Princess Lyra, but something had changed between them. No longer was she the distant, untouchable royal he had first met. Instead, he saw her as a person, someone who, despite her power and title, carried a heavy burden. Mark couldn't help but notice the way she would sometimes drift into silence, her thoughts far away, even in the middle of a conversation. There were moments when her eyes would glaze over, and he would catch the faintest sigh escape her lips. It was as if she was trapped in a world of expectations, unable to break free. One evening, after another long day of formal events, Lyra invited Mark to join her for dinner in the palace's private dining room. It was a rare moment of peace, just the two of them. As they sat at the long table, the flickering candlelight cast soft shadows across her face, making her look even more distant than usual. "Is something troubling you, Your Highness?" Mark asked, his voice tentative. He had learned to be careful around her, to not overstep his boundaries, but he couldn't ignore the way she seemed so burdened. Lyra put down her fork, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like ages. She studied him quietly, almost as if she were weighing whether or not to speak. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "It's not easy being in my position, Mark," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I carry the weight of an entire empire on my shoulders, and no matter what I do, it's never enough. Every decision I make is scrutinized, and every move I make is watched." Mark frowned, unsure of how to respond. He had never thought about it that way. For most of his life, he had simply followed orders. He hadn't been the one to make life-altering decisions. He couldn't imagine the kind of pressure Lyra must face every day. "I spent my whole life being told what I must do, how I must act," she continued, her eyes staring down at the table. "And now I have to decide the future of a people I barely know. How am I supposed to be perfect? How can anyone live up to such expectations?" Her words hit Mark harder than he expected. He had seen the princess as powerful and unshakable, someone who seemed to have everything under control. But now, hearing the doubt in her voice, he realized how fragile she was behind that mask of royalty. "You don't have to be perfect," Mark said quietly. No one is. And no one expects you to carry the weight of an empire alone. Lyra's eyes flickered up to meet his. For a moment, she seemed unsure, but then a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Thank you, Mark, she said softly. It's just, I've never had anyone tell me that before. Everyone around me is always trying to shape me into something I'm not, something I can never be. But you see me as I am. Mark felt a warmth spread through him. He didn't know if he was ready to be the person who could take away her burdens, but he felt an overwhelming need to help her, to make her see that she wasn't alone. As the evening wore on, they talked more, their conversation shifting from the weight of her duties to lighter topics. Mark shared stories of his travels, and Lyra laughed, a sound Mark had never heard before. It was soft, genuine, and unlike the royal laughter he had heard in public. For the first time, she seemed like she was just a person, not a princess. And for the first time, Mark saw a glimpse of what life could be like if they were free from the roles they had been forced to play. It was a small moment, but it meant more to Mark than he could put into words. The walls between them were starting to crumble, and in that quiet room, they both took a step towards something neither of them had expected. The battle raged on outside the palace walls. Mark stood alongside Princess Lyra, both of them just inside a safe room within the palace, looking out through the narrow windows. The once peaceful city now felt like a battlefield, the sounds of explosions and clashing forces echoing through the air. The palace, which had always been a symbol of power and safety, now seemed vulnerable. Mark's grip tightened on the hilt of his weapon, though he knew there was little he could do to stop the chaos outside. His job was to protect the princess, and he was determined to do that, no matter the cost. But as he glanced over at Lyra, standing tall and composed despite the circumstances, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. She had been more than just a royal to him these past few days. She had become a person he cared about, someone whose burdens he shared, even if only in small moments. They had grown closer in a way that neither of them could have expected. It wasn't just duty anymore, it was something deeper. Lyra turned to face him, her expression serious, but her eyes holding something more. Mark, she said softly, her voice carrying a weight he hadn't heard before. I've been thinking about what you said, about not having to be perfect. Mark didn't respond immediately, unsure of what she was getting at. He had said those words in passing, trying to comfort her during a moment of vulnerability, but now they felt heavier. Lyra walked a few steps closer, the soft light from the nearby lamps casting gentle shadows on her face. I spent so much of my life trying to live up to an impossible standard. But now, with everything happening, this war, my responsibilities, everything, I realize I've never really lived for myself. I've only lived for others, for the empire, for my family, for the people who depend on me. Mark's heart ached as he watched her struggle to put her feelings into words. She was the leader of an empire, yet she was just a woman who wanted something more than the weight of her title. I never asked for this life, she continued, her voice quieter now. But now, I feel trapped. I'm stuck in a role that everyone else has chosen for me. I don't know how to break free from it. Mark stepped closer, his own heart heavy with empathy. You don't have to do everything alone, he said softly. And you don't have to be perfect. You're not just a princess, Lyra. You're a person, just like anyone else. You have the right to live for yourself, too. Lyra looked at him, her gaze intense. It was as though she were seeing him for the first time, really seeing him, not as a guard, but as someone who understood her in a way no one else did. For a moment, the weight of her title seemed to disappear, and all that remained was the woman standing in front of him, vulnerable and uncertain, yet somehow stronger for it. Thank you, Mark, she whispered. I don't know if I'm ready to make that change. But knowing that you're here with me, that I'm not alone, that means more than you could ever understand. Mark gave a small, reassuring smile. I'm not going anywhere. For a long time, They stood there, the world outside uncertain, the city fighting for its future. But in that small, quiet room, it felt like time had stopped. It felt like they were two people, not a princess and a soldier, but simply two souls trying to make sense of the world around them. Mark didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. This connection they shared would be something that couldn't be broken, no matter what came next. The days had passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. The war outside the palace raged on, with no clear winner in sight. Mark had never felt so helpless. As a soldier, he was trained to fight, to protect, to act decisively. But in the face of this chaos, all he could do was stand by Princess Lyra and watch as she carried the weight of the empire on her shoulders. Despite the danger and the pressure, there were moments between them that still felt peaceful. In the quiet hours, when the world outside seemed far away, Mark and Lyra would find small moments of connection. They would talk about the things they missed. Lyra would speak of her childhood, when the palace was just a place to explore, not a fortress. Mark would share stories of his travels across the galaxy, of places he'd seen and people he'd met. These moments, simple as they were, allowed them both to escape the storm for a little while. But there was always the unspoken tension that lingered between them, something that neither of them could ignore for long. Mark had felt it growing between them, the undeniable pull of something more than just duty. And Lyra, though she tried to remain strong, couldn't hide the truth from herself any longer. One evening, as the sky outside darkened and the sounds of the battle grew distant, Lyra stood by the window of the safe room, staring out at the city. Mark was sitting across the room, his eyes never straying far from her. He had learned to be patient, to give her space when she needed it. But tonight, something was different. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Finally, Lyra broke the silence. "Mark," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I need to tell you something." Mark looked up, surprised by the seriousness in her tone. He nodded, his heart beating a little faster. He had never seen her like this before, so open and vulnerable. "I've been thinking a lot," Lyra continued, her back still turned to him. "About everything. About this war, about my responsibilities, and about you." Mark felt his pulse quicken. He stood up slowly, unsure of what she was going to say. "What do you mean, Your Highness?" Lyra took a deep breath before turning to face him. Her eyes, usually so guarded, were now filled with something Mark couldn't quite place. Something soft, something real. "I've never had anyone see me the way you do, Mark," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Everyone else sees me as a princess, a leader. They expect me to be perfect, to be strong. But you've seen me as just me. You've treated me like a person, not a title." Mark was speechless. He hadn't expected this. He had always tried to be nothing more than a soldier in her eyes, someone whose job was to protect her, nothing more. But in that moment, he realized that maybe she had seen something in him that he hadn't fully understood until now. "I can't keep pretending anymore," Lyra continued, taking the small step toward him. "I can't keep hiding from what I feel. These past few days I've been afraid. Afraid of letting myself care for someone. Afraid of what it might mean for my duty. But I can't ignore it anymore." Her words hung in the air between them, and Mark felt his heart race. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he knew that whatever happened next, everything would change. "I care about you, Mark," Lyra whispered, "more than I've ever cared for anyone." The confession hung between them, a moment of raw honesty. Mark didn't know what to say at first. His emotions were tangled, his mind racing. All he had ever wanted was to protect her, but now he was faced with something he hadn't been prepared for, his own feelings. I care about you too, Lyra," Mark finally said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "More than I should." Lyra's eyes softened, a quiet relief settling over her face. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to be perfect. She didn't have to hide behind the mask of the princess. In this moment, she was just Lyra, and Mark was just Mark. And together, they could face whatever came next. They didn't need to say more. The silence between them was enough. Full of promise, full of understanding. The quiet moment that followed Lyra's confession was intense. Mark felt like the ground had shifted beneath him, but he couldn't fully process what had just happened. She cared about him. That thought was still swirling in his head. He had always tried to keep his emotions in check, always focused on his duty. But now, he realized, he couldn't ignore his feelings for her any longer. For the first time since the war began, Mark found himself unsure of what to do. He had always been a soldier, decisive, trained to act when needed. But now, with Lyra so close, everything seemed more complicated. Lyra, too, seemed to struggle with what they had just shared. She stood quietly, her back to him, her shoulders tense. She wasn't the powerful princess anymore. She was just a woman, confused, vulnerable, and afraid of what her feelings might cost her. "Mark," she said, her voice low, but clear. "I don't know what this means. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with these feelings. I can't." She stopped mid-sentence, biting her lip in frustration. Mark could see the battle in her eyes, the push and pull between the leader she had been trained to be and the woman she was beginning to realize she could be. She was caught between the role of the princess and the possibility of something personal, something real. Mark wanted to say something, to comfort her, but the words didn't come. He couldn't be sure how she felt anymore. Had he just complicated everything? Should he have kept his feelings hidden? He thought he understood what was at stake here, but now he wasn't so sure. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say," Mark admitted, stepping closer. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you. I care about you, Lyra, and I didn't want to hide it anymore." Lyra turned to face him, her eyes filled with conflict. "But this isn't just about us, Mark. I'm responsible for so many lives. The Empire, the war. How can I focus on what I feel when everything is falling apart outside these walls? If I let myself feel, I risk losing everything." Her words hit Mark hard. He had always known that she carried the weight of her position, but hearing it like this, hearing the fear in her voice, it made him understand just how much pressure she was under. "I don't want you to lose everything," Mark said, his voice strong, though his heart ached. "I just want you to be happy, to have something real. You deserve that." Lyra shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, but the vulnerability in her face made Mark's chest tighten. "I don't know if I can have that, Mark. I don't know if I'm allowed to." The princess was so used to living for others, to living up to impossible expectations. For so long, she had been trapped in the image of the perfect ruler, the ideal leader. But now, standing in front of Mark, she saw a chance for something different. She saw a chance to be loved, to love in return. But the fear of losing control, of breaking down the walls she had built around herself, held her back. Mark reached out, gently placing his hand on hers. "I'm not asking for anything from you, Lyra. I'm not asking you to change anything. I just want you to know that I'm here, that I care for you, and I'll support whatever you choose." Lyra took a shaky breath, still unsure, still trapped in the conflict between duty and desire. The weight of her crown, the responsibility she carried, pressed down on her. The future of her empire was at stake, and no matter how much she wanted to feel, to be with Mark, she couldn't escape the truth that her role as princess came first. For a moment, they stood there, both unsure of what came next. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words, with longing, with fear. "I don't know if I can do this," Lyra whispered, pulling her hand away gently. "But I need time to think." Mark nodded slowly, understanding. "Take all the time you need." As she turned away from him, Mark couldn't help but feel the distance between them grow. It wasn't just the war that was keeping them apart. It was the responsibilities, the choices that Lyra had to make, that no one could understand except her. And though Mark knew he couldn't change her path, He would be there, waiting, no matter how long it took. The days that followed were filled with tension. The war outside the palace continued to escalate, and Lyra, despite her personal struggles, threw herself back into her duties as the princess. Mark stayed close, guarding her, as always, but he could feel the change between them. Lyra was distant again, just as she had been when they first met. It was as if her confession had never happened, as if the words they had shared were nothing more than a fleeting moment. Mark tried not to dwell on it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had told him she cared about him, and he had opened up in return. But now, it seemed like she was hiding behind the walls she had built for so long. She was doing what she always did, acting as though nothing had changed. Mark didn't know if he had misunderstood her or if she was just too afraid to face what they had shared. He tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing on his role as her protector. But in his quiet moments when he was alone, he couldn't help but wonder where they stood. One evening, after another long day of meetings and strategy sessions, Mark and Lyra found themselves alone in the palace gardens. The city was quiet, the stars twinkling above them in the clear night sky. Lyra stood near a fountain, her arms crossed, staring at the water. Mark hesitated for a moment, then slowly approached her. "Your Highness," he said softly, not wanting to disturb the silence too abruptly. "Can we talk?" Lyra turned to him, her expression unreadable. She nodded slowly, but didn't speak. "I know things have been complicated," Mark continued, choosing his words carefully. "But I just want to understand. I need to know where we stand. Are we still on the same page?" Lyra's eyes flickered for a moment, and for a split second, Mark thought she might say something, anything. But she only sighed deeply, the weight of her role once again settling over her. "I don't know, Mark," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say anymore. I care about you. I do. But I'm so afraid of what that means. I'm afraid of losing control. I'm afraid of making the wrong choice." Mark took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He had waited for her to say these words, but now that she had, it only made everything feel more uncertain. "I don't want you to lose control," he said, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "But you're not alone, Lyra. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself. We can face whatever comes together. I care about you, and I'm not going anywhere." Lyra looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face, as though looking for something. Mark stood there, his heart in his throat, waiting for her response. Then, with a soft breath, Lyra finally spoke. "I'm sorry I've been distant, Mark. I've been pushing you away because I was scared, but I can't keep pretending that nothing has changed. I do love you, Mark. I've loved you for longer than I realized." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped, but hearing her say the words, he wasn't prepared for how it felt. There was relief, but also a deep sense of awe. "You love me?" Mark asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Lyra nodded, her eyes now filled with a mix of fear and hope. "Yes, I do, and I can't pretend I don't feel it anymore. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I can't let you go, not when you've become so important to me." Mark reached for her hand, pulling her gently toward him. This time, there was no hesitation, no distance. They were standing at the edge of a new chapter, uncertain but united. "You don't have to pretend," Mark said softly, his hand holding hers tightly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." And in that moment, with the weight of the galaxy pressing down on them, the two of them found something real, a connection that neither the war nor their duties could tear apart. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. The days after Lyra's confession were quieter, but no less intense. The war still raged outside, and the Empire's future was uncertain. But for Mark and Lyra, things had shifted. Their bond, once buried beneath layers of duty and responsibility, had finally come to the surface. They had confessed their feelings, and now more than ever, they knew they couldn't ignore the truth. Mark had always known that his feelings for Lyra went beyond just duty. He had tried to keep his emotions in check, focusing on protecting her, but now, with her confession, everything felt more complicated. Lyra, too, had been living with a constant battle inside her, torn between the life she had been given as a princess and the desires of her heart. One evening, after a particularly tense day of planning their next moves in the war, Lyra and Mark found themselves alone once again. They had retreated to one of the palace's quieter rooms, away from the soldiers and the constant buzz of responsibility. For a brief moment, it felt like the world had faded away, leaving just the two of them. Lyra stood by the window, gazing out at the city. The lights from the buildings below twinkled in the distance, a stark contrast to the uncertainty of their situation. Mark watched her for a long moment, his heart heavy with the unspoken words that still hung between them. "Mark," Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts. "I've been thinking about what we both want, about what I want." Mark stepped closer to her, his heart pounding. "What do you want, Lyra?" She turned to face him, her expression serious. "I want to be more than just a symbol. I don't want to be the perfect princess anymore. I want to be a person who can make choices, who can live her life, not just fulfill the expectations others have for me." Mark nodded, understanding. He knew how difficult it was for her to break free from the role she had been born into. Her entire life had been shaped by duty, by the empire, by her family. But now, for the first time, she was thinking about herself, about what made her truly happy. "And I want you, Mark," she continued, her voice soft but steady. "I've never allowed myself to think about this before, but now, I know I can't keep denying it. I want to be with you." Mark's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the truth he had longed to hear. He stepped closer, reaching for her hand. "Lyra, I want that too, more than anything." But as soon as the words left his mouth, the reality of their situation hit him. Lyra wasn't just a woman. She was the princess of a vast empire. She couldn't simply walk away from her duties, from the people who depended on her. Mark, though he wanted to be with her, knew that the world they lived in wouldn't make that easy. "What does this mean for us, though?" Mark asked, his voice uncertain. "I know you want to be free, but your people need you, Lyra. The empire is at war. You can't just step away from all of that." Lyra's eyes softened, and she squeezed his hand. "I know, and I don't want to abandon my responsibilities. But I also know I can't do this alone. I don't have to be perfect, and I don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. I have you, Mark. And together, we'll figure out how to make it work." Mark looked at her, his heart full of both fear and hope. They didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long while, they both knew what mattered. They had each other, and that was enough. "Together," he whispered, his voice steady with resolve. "We'll figure it out together." As the weight of the Empire's future still loomed over them, Mark and Lyra stood side by side, ready to face whatever challenges came their way. With their bond stronger than ever, they knew that no matter how uncertain the road ahead, they would face it together. The days that followed felt different. The air was still thick with the weight of the war and the responsibilities that Lyra carried. But now, there was something new between her and Mark. Their bond, once uncertain, was now a steady force that neither of them could ignore. They had faced the truth, and though the future was still unclear, they had made a choice to face it together. Mark stood at the balcony of the palace, looking out at the darkened city below. The war was still raging, but things felt quieter, somehow. The city had been a symbol of power, of control, but now it felt like something more, a place where people lived, where there was hope, and where Lyra's voice would continue to guide them, not just as a princess, but as a woman who knew what it meant to truly lead. Lyra joined him, her footsteps soft on the stone floor. The night air was cool, and she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to find comfort in the stillness of the moment. "You're thinking about everything again," Mark said, glancing at her with a gentle smile. He could see the weight of the world in her eyes, but there was something different now. There was a strength in her, a strength that came from knowing she didn't have to do it alone. Lyra smiled back, but it was faint. "I'm thinking about what's next. I'm thinking about what kind of leader I want to be. The kind of person I want to be." She turned to him, her eyes filled with honesty. "The truth is, I've always been afraid of being something other than what everyone expected. But now, I can't keep living for them. I need to live for myself, for us." Mark stepped closer to her, his heart swelling with admiration. Lyra had always carried the burden of her title, but now she was beginning to understand that she could still be herself while leading. The weight didn't have to crush her. It could be shared. "You're already a leader," Mark said softly, placing his hand on hers. "And you don't have to carry it all. You don't have to be perfect. You just need to be the best version of yourself, and that's more than enough." Lyra looked at him, her gaze full of warmth. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. She didn't feel trapped by her title or by the expectations placed on her. She had Mark, his strength, his loyalty, his love. And that, more than anything, made her feel like she could face whatever came next. "I'm scared, Mark," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what the future holds, and I don't know how to be everything my people need me to be. But I do know one thing." Mark looked into her eyes, waiting for her to continue. "I know that with you by my side," Lyra said, squeezing his hand, "I can do this. We can do this. Together." The words felt like a promise, a vow. In that moment, Mark knew that no matter the challenges ahead, they would face them side by side. He wasn't just her guard anymore. He was her partner. And together, they would build something stronger than just an empire. They would build a future. The war wasn't over. The road ahead would be difficult. But as the city stretched out before them, Mark and Lyra stood together, ready to face whatever came next. Their bond was their strength, and that was enough to take on anything the universe threw their way. They had each other, and that was where their true power lay. And for the first time, both Mark and Lyra knew that the future, uncertain as it was, would be theirs to shape, together.